All right, we're going to go ahead and pull the wheel off. Now, one of the things that has given British cars a bad rap forever, and it's no difference here, there's a mix of standard and metric fasteners. One very important part is the wheels. The wheels are a 7/8 inch socket. They're not metric. If you use a metric socket that fits, they'll come off, but if you're going to round off the corners of the lug nuts, you're just going to make your life miserable. So we have our wheel key, and I have the 7/8 socket loaded up. We'll go ahead and let's pull the wheel off. Okay, so we have the wheels off. We're going to go ahead and start removing the lower control arms. One thing to note, on these particular vehicles, the alignment is set by eccentrics on the lower control arm bushings, front and rear. So you move the lower control arm out or in. That helps adjust for camber, caster, and all the things. I don't have an alignment rack here, and I have to drive this truck 2 hours back north where I can get an alignment. So what I'm going to do when we take these bolts off, before I do, I'm going to clean off the area, remove all the salt and road grime, and I'm going to take a Sharpie, and I'm going to mark where the eccentrics are now, and that way when I put the control arms, the new control arms in, at least that gives us a benchmark, a starting point for the alignment. So it's not going to be exact, it will need to be aligned, but it'll at least get us home, and it should be pretty close. Okay, so we're getting ready to disassemble the lower control arms. So we have the eccentric bolts right here. I'm going to go ahead and mark a reference point on the front and rear eccentric bolts of both control arms on both sides. That'll allow me to put this back close to where it was when we reassemble the components. That does it. So now we're going to pull the axle and the brake assembly, and we'll start to disassemble the parts. Start off removing the axle nut. Have the socket size right here, so we're going to go ahead and pull that off. Set that aside. We do not want to lose that axle nut. Now, if you're removing these at home, one thing you never, ever, 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 ever want to do is hit the end of the stub axle with a hammer. These are fairly soft metal. Hit it with a hammer, you're going to mess up the threads. You won't be able to get the nut back on. If you do, it'll cross-thread it. It messes things up. It's all bad. So in the middle of these axles, there is a dimple. The dimple actually aligns to the punch of an air chisel. So what we'll do, we'll just center our air chisel. And it pushed right out of the... All right, so we have our 10mm socket. No, that's not the size of the bolts on the brake caliper bracket, but there is a little fixture right here, and it routes the brake hose, a wheel speed sensor wire, and the brake pad wear sensor. So we want to remove this bolt. Now you can get the caliper off without it, but what's going to happen is this causes a pinch point with the wires and the hose. You're going to put undue stress on the components. So just take this 10mm bolt out. We have our impact here. I'm going to go ahead and remove our brake caliper knuckle. Now I'm not going to remove the caliper from the bracket. I'm going to take the whole assembly off, and it requires 2 bolts. On this truck, it's a 13/16 12-point socket. I have an impact, and I have an impact swivel. Let's go ahead and take off the caliper bracket bolts. All right, so we have the caliper bracket bolts off. So what we want to do is very carefully slide this out of the way. And I already have my strap staged here. So what we're going to do is grab our tail. All right. And we're going to create a sling for the brake pad. So for the caliper assembly. All right, so I have my brake caliper unbolted. We have it hanging here by a strap. It doesn't put any strain or pressure this way on the brake line or any of the other fittings. So this will keep the sensors from breaking, keep the brake line from collapsing internally. It's just the right way to do it. So when you remove a brake caliper, never, ever, ever let it hang by the hose. All right, we're going to remove the lower ball joint here. So now I want to remove the bolt for the strut. So on this, it's about an 8-inch bolt. So we've got a wrench on one side. We're going to remove the through bolt, and that will allow us to drive out the strut retaining bolt. So the bolt didn't come out just like we wanted the first time. I did get the nut off, so we have our persuader. Notice I'm using a brass hammer, so I'm not going to damage anything. We're going to go ahead and give this a couple wraps and just pop this out. It should come out relatively easy. Now there will be some light pressure from the air shock, but since we let the system up on the jack, it depressurizes itself. It's not like a coil spring, okay? So in this case, we're safe. The strut didn't lurch or release a whole bunch of energy. So on these trucks, once you lift them up, you're good. So that takes the tension off the strut. We got our bolt out. Like I told you, it's a big one. Back. So what I have is the persuader. This is a 48-ounce ball peen hammer. I love it. Now again, be really careful with this because anything this guy hits, it's going to cause some damage. Now what we want to do is strike the knuckle where the ball joint goes down into the mating hole. So since it's a taper fit, the goal is to kind of jar it loose. So we'll just give a couple wraps here. Now again, don't do this if you want to reuse the ball joints, but I'm going to give it a whack on the bottom of the threads, and as you can see, it has popped loose. There is no way to get the lower ball joint from the knuckle completely with the axle in place. So what we're going to do, I'm going to leave the tie rod attached, but we're going to use a 19mm socket. I'm going to remove the upper ball joint, and we're just going to pop it loose out of the knuckle, and that way we can move the assembly out of the way. I can pop the axle back enough that will allow us to sneak the lower ball joint out of there, and then we can start putting everything on the bench, and I'll show you the old versus new lower control arm. All right, so what we're seeing right now, so I'm going to take my persuader, not striking the threads of the upper ball joint because I need to reuse this. I'm just going to strike the knuckle. And there it goes. It has released the pressure. You don't have to beat the hell out of it. Just give it a few smacks on the surrounding. Now, if you have knuckles made out of aluminum, be really, really careful hitting them. Aluminum will crack and it will cause you problems. These are cast iron on the Rovers, so we're good to go, but just keep that in mind moving forward. You actually want to drive the knuckle out through the hub, which on this one it's pretty tight, so I'm going to grab the air hammer here. We're going to finish pushing it out, and then I'll be able to swing the knuckle out of our way. And there we have it. All right, so it's a good thing that I paid attention when they taught us knots in high school. So we used some rope. I got this tied up out of the way just so it's not putting any excess stress on the inner tie rod. So now we're going to go ahead and unbolt the lower control arm. All right, here we are under the truck. I'm going to go ahead and unbolt this rear lower control arm bolt.
We need a swivel on this because the exhaust cap is right here above the bolt.
So I have our BAR, our big ass ratchet. This is fantastic. Anyway, so yeah, I'm under the car. We're hunched over, dodging drops of nasty, salty road water because it is Indiana and no shot would be complete without salt in the mouth. So let's go ahead and break these bolts loose, and then we'll pop this lower control arm free from its home. All right, sweet, that one's loose. We'll go ahead on the front one. Ah. All right, those are moment of truth. Got our brass hammer. All the nuts are off, so I'm going to attempt to drive these bolts out. Sweet. They actually came loose. Don't want to lose my washer because, again, that would suck. So our lower bolt is free. Here are the marks that we made on our eccentric cam. Knock the front one loose. All right, we got it free, so we're going to pan over here to the bench. technical difficulties and we ended up losing a chunk of audio. But here you see the old and the new lower control arm sitting on the bench. We've made sure that the two parts are the same, and you can actually see on the old lower control arm bushing that the rubber has started to pull away from the bushing housing. This is how you can tell whether the bushings have failed or not. There will be cracks and separation on the rubber component between the bushing and the body of the bushing itself.